Right, educational talk, chit chat, whatever. We've got CALUM RAISTRICK here from the Muscle Mentors, who at the minute is pretty much the peaking king with looking at his athletes. He's got, how many he got this weekend?
11.
11. 2 dropped off, or was it? He said 13 yesterday.
No, well, 2 next weekend.
Oh, okay.
I just said 13 to make it more dramatic.
Make it more dramatic. I can't do it because I've got 13.
That's why I feel bad for me.
Molly said to me, when she said it, she goes, he won't have 13, he'll just try and what's it. Yeah. Anyway.
Just take the number and double it, and then you'll be all right.
You'll be fine. We're going to go through peak week protocols, not necessarily all of them, but ones that Callum trusts. So, what is peak week, Callum?
It's the week before your show.
What needs to be achieved prior to implementing anything into a peak week?
You've got to diet first. I think the biggest thing there is like not viewing peak week as a blanket term as like anything magical.
Yeah,
you know, the work has got to be done in the prep itself. Like if you're going into that final week with work still to be done, then
you're not ready. It's
not much is going to change in that regard.
Because when you speak to people, they commonly just discuss that, don't they? They're 9 weeks out, but they're 8 weeks out because of peak week, and they think that something's meticulously going to happen. And then if you're still, like say, fat, you can't implement anything. But like from a coaching point, this is where the thing is. From a coaching point, like you obviously collect loads of data through that process of getting them lean and knowing how many calories here and how many calories there. So say client A, Tom, is peeled to the bone. What would be the protocol now? Would it, like, you obviously people carb deplete, people fat load? What would your approach be, or is it individual to the?
I think it's really individual. So, like this year, you'll see even like if you look now, like the main UK coaches at the moment who are prepping people, there's always a slightly different spin on their approaches, but everyone's basically kind of bringing into the same result. But the common trend is there that the client is ready before any of that stuff begins.
Yeah.
So whether that's Joe fat loading someone into a show, or whether that is someone doing a conventional load and then using, a little bit of diazide or whatever it might be, or whether that's someone bringing their calories back to maintenance over the last couple of weeks prior to prep and then just running into the show as they normally would.
The
common nominality there is the fact that the client is lean enough to step on stage before any of that happens.
And then just getting them kind of...
And then it's just the approach that you take. Like, the different coaches are going to have different preferences. Like, I've got 9 people competing over the weekend, and they're not all doing the same protocol.
That's the term here, isn't it? That's why I wanted to ask this, because it's so much individuality and that data that you collect that is going to govern what you do with the individual.
Yeah.
Would you say that with, let's say you've got a physique competitor, a classic guy, and a bodybuilder, would those protocols change, or?
I think the main thing about the protocol that would probably be different would be the level of musculature or body mass that individual had would probably change the aggressive nature that you would load them. So, say if you had a super heavyweight bodybuilder who was 120 kilos when he weighed in, versus a men's physique competitor who might be 90 kilos. Their individual requirements for calories and fluid and electrolytes, all those kind of key components are going to be very different. But there are kind of commonalities between each client. So like if we look across the board, every single one of those clients has been tapering stress for the last kind of 7 to 10 days. Every single one of those clients has gradually, if there was cardio there 2 weeks ago, it's gradually been tapered out. If there were a high step count, it's been gradually tapered out. If they're using a vest when they're doing their steps, it's been gradually tapered out. Every single one of those clients moving into that last week will be tracking, a fluid intake per day. They'll be tracking a sodium intake per day and potentially a potassium intake. They'll be tracking caffeine intake. They'll be tracking, calorie input, carbs, fats, proteins. And they're, all those clients are in a position where they're deliberately trying to mitigate or minimize fatigue. So, potentially in that last 7 to 10 days, they're all in a position where training volume's probably pulled down a little bit, or they have reduced the level of exposure they've had to fatigue. So like taking sets to failure, for example, they've reduced the exposure to that, because the goal is not, muscle damage by that point. It's just basically keeping them safe. And then the complexity of that is the fact that there are multiple ways you can play that. So, like, I guess the general rule of thumb for most people would be, if you go into a loading scenario, whether you're doing that load earlier in the week or later in the week, A, you've got to be ready before that load begins. B, we've got technically 4 components there to the load. So we've got protein in that last week can just stay at a minimal dose, so like 0.8 to 1 gram per pound. Yeah. So if you had a 200 pound bodybuilder, it might be like 180 to 200 grams of protein max. Could be lower, because protein is not really serving a purpose at that point. It could be much lower. And then we have carbohydrate and we have fat. Chances are that client has had a relatively low fat approach for a significant amount of time in that diet. So say, for example, your shoot prep diet now is 30 grams of fat or 25 grams of fat, whatever it might be. Over that period of time, just like carbohydrates would replenish and saturate glycogen, dietary fat will replenish and saturate intramuscular triglycerides. So there's space within a muscle, and some of that will be triglyceride based, some of that will be glycogen based, and then we have fluid and we have electrolytes. And we're trying to basically fill that. We're trying to basically account for all of those components before we actually bring them on stage. Okay, so usually speaking, for most people, the way I'd run it would be, you dump the stress first.
Yeah.
You saturate triglycerides, you saturate glycogen, and then you dry out. So that loading process is very different to the drying out process. We don't try and achieve them both at the same time. So we fill and then we dry.
We dry out, yeah.
And the speed in which you dry out is going to be relative to your approach. So say if you've got someone who is a natural competitor, or even an enhanced competitor, who's just using that drying out process by manipulating electrolytes and water, for example. So they're basically tapering, simple example, they're tapering salt and they're tapering water a little bit earlier in the day to what they normally would. So like, I always use the general rule of thumb that water always follows sodium. So a typical scenario would be they're on stage at 2 p.m. on the Sunday. Yeah. So on the Saturday, I'm going to saturate earlier in the day and having a cut-off. Sodium goes in earlier. Water goes in 3 hours after that, and about 16 to 18 hours before they step on stage. That means that sodium's in now. 3 hours after that, water's in, and the sodium could be their normal daily allowance. So say if they're having 5 grams of pink salt a day, that 5 grams of pink salt goes in by say 2 p.m. and then by 5 p.m. they're in a position where their whole daily fluid intake has gone in, and potentially a little bit more. And
then you just sip from that.
Yeah, this process is what we refer to as the ability to drive diuresis. So diuresis is basically your body's rate in which it's excreting fluid. Okay, so if you imagine like turning a tap on, you only get one opportunity to do that. Okay, so one of the typical kind of potentially older ways of thinking would be, you get clients who are loading water, for example, much earlier in the week. So 10 litres on Monday, 8 litres on Thursday, whatever it might be, and it goes down and down and down. Now, what we want to do is we want to time the proximity of drive and diuresis relative to stage, and we only get one opportunity at doing that. Okay, so that process is you're depleting sodium because water's going high and sodium's dropping. Okay, and as water goes high and we push the fluid intake up, that rate of diuresis basically continues to be accelerated past the point of us not putting fluid back in. So if we suddenly go from say 5 litres of water a day to 7 litres of water a day, and I've got that in the daytime in a much shorter time frame than I normally would, say by 6 p.m, my body is now basically at a set point of excreting fluid at this rate, but I'm not now putting anything back in. So over the course of that evening and over the course of the next day, I'm pushing more fluid out, and that fluid's mainly coming from extracellular storage, and some will be pulled from muscle. And that's essentially the process of...
Would your body kind of dispose of that quickly?
Out. What do you mean?
Like, would you be using the toilet longer, quicker?
Yeah, you do more frequent bathroom visits.
Yeah.
So you can even measure overnight, for example, like during that 1 day out protocol, you could measure how much fluid's excreted overnight by when in pre-bed or in the morning, or even measuring out fluid volume of urination overnight. So you can kind of start to monitor from peak to peak how long you need to leave in that time frame to allow that process of drying out to occur, and what the timings you're going to need to have for sodium in by that point, water in by that point, and then cut.
Nothing from that.
So you might find that, say, first show of the year, a client has, we might use a 2 p.m. stage time. It's a 2 p.m. sodium cutoff and it's a 5 p.m. fluid cutoff. And we actually find that the following day for the first show, they were urinating heavily all the way up until stage. Well, ideally, we want that to be stopping, a few hours before they step on stage.
Yeah.
So we might just adjust the timing of that for the next show, and we might go, right, we actually need to get sodium in a couple of hours before that and fluid in a couple of hours before that to time it appropriately.
And limit it from that point on.
Yeah. So the drying out process could be relative to the protocol. So you take someone who's using a pharmaceutical diuretic, so for example, like a small amount of diazide. Really, like the only diuretic I've used ever is just diazide. And for most people, it will be, if we're going to use it, it'll be maybe a quarterly, half a tab. And we'll obviously monitor that as we move, and we'll have got a predictable response because that would have been kind of trialed in the past.
Would that be more implemented if, let's say, you potentially spilled over on carbohydrates?
Yeah, so like
implement that?
A lot of coaches will use the diuretic protocol as part of the plan.
peaking
So it's part of the plan in general. You could use the diazide, which is potassium sparing up to a point. You could use the diazide as a backup.
Yeah.
So like pack it in your bag.
Have it available.
And if we're in a position where we're not quite happy with that evening look, then we could put a quarter diazide in before bed just to push that process a little bit harder. Or you're going to get some people who might, there's been a couple of times this year where there's been experimentative shows with clients where we might go and pick a random show somewhere just as data, and I've loaded them all the way into the show, and we've used, a quarter or half a tab of diazide that evening, and then maybe the middle of the night, and then loaded them, carried them into the morning show just to gather data and see what it looks like.
Just the data collection for that particular individual to make sure the rest is successful rather than...
Yeah, so it's... The thing with this is, like, if you've got a one show prep with a client, then there's not a lot of wiggle room that you can realistically trial this stuff unless you've done it.
You've got to minimise risk.
Whereas if you've got, a regional and then a pro qualifier, or you've got a regional and then a pro qualifier and then another pro qualifier and then another pro qualifier, you can just refine it as you move. If you're going to trial this stuff back end of prep before the actual show, then ideally they'd be pretty damn lean before you even start experimenting with this stuff. But I guess the take-home point there is it's not like a blanket one size fits all, but similar patterns following.
You couldn't write an actual blueprint to peaking because
you could in terms of the basic fundamental things, but it'd
be like a spider chart in case like this happens.
Yeah,
and if this doesn't,
you could if you notice this, then it goes down that pathway, and you can
have a graph on it.
You could write a blueprint, but obviously there'd always be some individual circumstance where there might be something that's a little bit off. With
the same kind of, obviously it would be again person dependent, but say within a female athlete, whether it's bikini or physique, in those realms, would those peaking kind of thought process you've just put in then deliberately go straight into a female prep? What manipulations would change?
So the only protocol I've ever run with a female is just literally fluid and electrolyte manipulation, and then vitamin C, vitamin B, and the H2O removed from anabolic designs I like as well. I've never used a pharmaceutical diuretic with a female, and I've never really seen the need. Because if we can get so for example, bikini athlete, you can just do that. You can just do that through fluid manipulation, or for the most part, for a lot of the girls I prepped this year, they've just literally run on with changing nothing. They just change it. They just keep everything consistent because the day-to-day look is perfect, and they're not looking for that hard element of condition. For figure, we probably want to play around with it a little bit, but even then, like for example, like Erin, she had 2 shows, one in the Bahamas and then one in Orlando, the Europa Pro I think it was. And to be fair, the first show there was a lot more stress because she was on her own, she was in a foreign country. There's a lot of, she was peaking clients herself. There was variables that were not ideal. and she did a cracking job. But again, for that first show, we manipulated more as well. It wasn't a calculated risk because I kind of knew what the response would be, but she flattened off quite a lot when we pulled fluid more aggressively. So, and I remember for the Bahamas show, it was pre-judging on the Saturday and then finals on the Sunday. It wasn't the same day. And when she got off stage on the Saturday, we reintroduced sodium and fluid more aggressively, and we put food back in. And she woke up on the Sunday and she looked better than she did at the pre-judge, more alive, more
because
fullness,
of the sodium
harder
electrolyte
for things being reintroduced. Because we cut it too hard the day before. And obviously the timing of that, it might work to an extent, but obviously once you push past that time frame, you can start kind of regressing there.
You've got that data now for ongoing shows.
But then even the following week, well, I think it was 10 days after when she did the one in Orlando, she loaded the entire week. So she did 6 days in a row of the diet that she did 2 days for in Bahamas. 6 high days, so 6 loading days in a row. And we kept fluid and salt high throughout the entire time. And that was the best look she had on stage. Partly potentially because the stress was lower, but also just because we kind of found a balance on where her body held best in that day-to-day look, and then we just didn't change it from there. So that's like the thing of like, you know, there'll be loads of people that will use these different protocols, but you know, if you've got a client who looks absolutely bang on a week before and that day-to-day look is 100% perfect, maybe you don't want to try and aim for another couple of percent by changing stuff. Maybe you just want to run them into the show as they are.
And see what they look like then, and then see what the feedback is from that.
Exactly.
So we've practically covered all these questions. The only one, but I think you've kind of covered it, is working out calorie needs within it. Is that kind of what you've worked out as you're leading up to them, of where their body is maintaining weight, where their body's increasing weight? So let's say for a carb load, is there not necessarily a formula, but if you're absolutely peeled, is there per kilogram to gram?
So glycogen saturation would be 12 to 13 grams per kilo to start.
Yeah.
So if you were running like
a free day,
refeed days or high days, you'd probably want to work up to 12 to 13 grams per kilogram as a general base number. And then obviously as someone gets more depleted, leaner, deeper in prep, that's going to have to increase over time.
Yeah. But a rule of thumb, if you went there, you'd
12 to 13 grams is
you'd probably
decent
not spill
figure.
too hard.
Yeah, you'd be about right. And then obviously the turnaround for glycogen would be about 36 hours. So, you know, if you're going to do a high day on a Thursday, I'd always usually do them in pairs of 2. So we do a 48-hour window of feeding higher to maintenance, or maybe into a little bit of a surplus. But you wouldn't really see any impact on the look properly until you get to kind of the back end of the following day.
Yeah.
And the same with body weight as well. It might not go up initially, but it probably will follow by going up a little bit after.
And just take that data to see when it comes back down to the baseline as such.
And then, you know, if you were, so if we follow that general rule of thumb of triglycerides, glycogen, fluid, then you would probably go. It depends. So if you've got a client who still has a little bit to come off, but you still want to follow that same trend, then you could literally take the calories that they're on day to day in the deficit. Yeah. You could pull protein right down. You could pull carbs right down.
And then
the simple thing would be to just take dietary fat to 2 grams per kilogram.
Yeah.
And then basically put protein at 0.6 to 0.8 per pound. And then the rest go from carbs. And carbs would be probably just trace only.
Maybe
from the 50 grams of carbs a day, whatever it might be. And that would be a pretty foolproof way of, quote unquote, conventionally fat loading someone.
Yeah.
And then when you come to put carbs in, then we just follow the general rule of thumb of fats go back down to maybe 0.4, 0.5 grams per kilogram, protein stays low, and then carbs obviously push up. And you could aim, then you could aim for that kind of 12, 13 gram per kilogram mark per day.
You've got a pretty solid structure to kind of base information off. And then with that, say updates, would you do like morning weight, post-workout weight, or pre-workout weight, and then pre-bed with pictures? Where would your
depends if they're going to have to hit a weight cap. So if you've got someone who's like, if you've got a bodybuilder who's in open class weight cap, and it's weight cap dependent, or if you've got the biggest one's classic physique is the hardest one to nail, because the weight caps are a little bit more refined. You would probably want to obviously the most ideal thing would be to get them well under the cap, in shape, managing
able to
fatigue
feed up,
first, to then be able to load without much stress of going over. But if you are in a position where it's like weight cap restricted, then you're going to have to just monitor how much food's going in, how much fluid's going in, and body weight at different points of the day. So you might literally do, like, if they're coming up to a weigh-ins and you're loading and you know you can only get a certain amount in, then you might have to do, you know, every meal we're doing this amount of food in by this time, this amount of fluid in by this time, and your weight is before this meal X.
And assess
So I can
trends.
then just adjust that as I needed to get them over the finish line in terms of making weight for the class. So it's the same as Connor did for the British.
Yeah, I
But
remember
obviously
that.
For Connor, it was that we had to cram a lot in a short space of time.
That was like, what was that? Dextrose, cream of rice,
And jam.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it looked fantastic. Because that was the show where you had men's physique, because you had freshwater, didn't you?
Yeah.
You had Connor. You had classic.
Frankie and Kieran.
Kieran, yeah.
And bikini with Becky.
That was a successful day.
That was the day that Becky turned pro.
That was a very good day. All right, we'll finish peaking protocols there. Next episode will be on training leading into and around peak week. Cheers, Cal.
My pleasure.